Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we're going to talk about one of my very favorite deck archetypes, the blue-red Spells Matter deck. And if we take a look here at our new player experience, of course, this is one of those archetypes that was very readily given to us. But the version of the deck just really wasn't quite strong enough for us to take seriously, but a significant enough archetype nonetheless that it was worth keeping on our radar. Today we are going to explore a more aggro version of the deck rather than just winning through card advantage. This is generally the most successful style of the red-blue spells. As you can see here, usually the naming convention would be a UR spells, but I have significantly left that as a question with the RU spells aggro, because this deck still has a lot of potential, but we're not quite there yet, specifically on the build type. So let's explore that and see exactly what we're talking about.
But before we get into all that, I am super excited at the prospect of getting to 500 subs, because that is going to allow me to do a lot of really cool community building stuff for y'all over on EtherHub. So take just a moment, do all those YouTube things to support the channel, and I won't have to be awkward about it. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right.
At the beginning of the Dominaria United season, we talked about Spellweaver being a fairly playable, reasonably upgradable deck with some alchemy potential because of, well, mostly those mono blue spells out of your alchemy only new player experience collection. And historic is pretty middle of the road, but until it finds an identity within this deck, how much impact it has on historic or historic has on it remains to be seen. Now that we have not only had the jump-in experience with Dominaria United, but drafted it as well, I think there's a good argument here to potentially raise the upgrade score to the perfect 3 here, making this a very upgradable deck and a lot of different situations and directions that it can go with that we are getting ready to talk about. But in so doing, that would raise our total score on this up to 8 if we're considering alchemy, or 7 if we're not. And that makes this potentially one of our top 5 decks, which means it really would not take much for this to be in consideration, not only as one of our budget grinders, and I believe probably our only blue grinder so far this season, but also potentially being a competitive springboard for us next season as well. All right, so allow me a moment to set the groundwork as we dive into the deck tech here. This deck is primarily built from our existing new player experience Spellslingers deck, the blue-red Spells Matter version. It is also using cards that you can get from the appropriate jump-in packs, as well as some fairly low-hanging fruit for anyone who has drafted Dominaria United. Outside of that, I haven't made any card choices here that would force a new player to go back and reach into those older sets that may not be the best thing to draft, at least at this point in time. The most notable example is our boy Delver of Secrets. That leads to a second point. One of the issues that this version of the deck has is it basically has 2 different aggro standpoints. The first being led by the standout uncommon Electrostatic Infantry, which encourages you to go tall on this or multiple copies of it, and then use your spells primarily to protect it. And then we have another standout uncommon, Balmor Battlemage Captain, both from Dominaria United. This creature, of course, wants you to go wide and then pumps your team and gives them trample for those hard-hitting turns. Electrostatic Infantry, obviously, more often than not, can hit multiple times because it's getting a boost to its toughness as well as its power. Balmor tends to be more of an alpha strike because, of course, it gives trample and an increased power, but does nothing for toughness. So your creatures that do get blocked are most likely not going to see another combat. But overall, it's just two very different strategies. And when you look at something like Delver of Secrets, this goes much better into that go wide strategy. But otherwise, that strategy is a little under-supported in something like this deck. Another accompaniment for the go tall would be something like Fairy Vandal from, oh goodness, what set is that? Oh, that's Streets of New Capenna. No wonder I couldn't remember the set symbol. This one obviously encourages you to draw multiple cards and make Fairy Vandal a ever-increasing threat, and fits better into that go tall strategy led by Electrostatic Infantry. I have built the deck this way because this early on we're basically testing both concepts as well as testing a lot of one-of cards like Flowstone Infusion, Fires of Victory, to a lesser degree Ghitu Amplifier. That card actually could work fairly nicely in both versions of the strategy. Twinferno also could work in both. And at this point, it's really about playing the deck and seeing what's working and what isn't, and also to kind of create a bridge until we start seeing things from Brothers War and have a better idea of what direction this deck should be taking. So this is a very easy list to build at the moment. It's not any huge investment or anything that you wouldn't otherwise draft, and allows us to be very flexible to move forward with this deck in either of the primary directions, possibly in a third yet to be revealed direction, or possibly not at all if this deck just isn't really gelling and coming together for us. So all in all, flexibility and testing is where this deck's at. And let's talk about the mana base. We kept it pretty basic here, obviously, for budget reasons. 7 islands, 8 mountains. We've got the single copy of Stormcarved Coast from your new player experience, and we're running 3 Swiftwater Cliffs. Even though this land coming into play tapped on turn 1 is potentially detrimental, there's a lot of reasons to hold those turn 1 spells potentially for later turns, so it's really not as bad as one might think here. It's not like we're missing an essential 1-drop creature. Possibly Delver of Secrets in a go wide strategy might change that if you have those older cards already in your collection. The most interesting choice here, I think, is the Soaring Springs, giving you a nice bounce effect out of your land base. Obviously, I think if we ended up going more with the go wide aspect here, the red legendary, whose name escapes me, but makes hasty tokens, is probably the way to go here. And we would probably run more than 1 copy, as much as your budget might allow. Alright, and starting with the 1-drops, we've got a pretty simple suite here of your basic utility spells. 3 copies of Consider, 2 Fading Hope, and 2 copies of Play with Fire, all from the new player experience. Obviously, if you've been around for a little while and have more copies of those, there is really no problem with running more, and we have yet to find the most synergistic value on that. I am running a single copy of Flowstone Infusion because it's something that easily could have been drafted or picked up from the jump-in lists, and this really gives you an instant speed that has no preference of whether you're running it in your turn or your opponent's turn. The Balmor version of the deck obviously wants you to run things during your turn, and counter spells really aren't indicative for that, so you don't see really any counter magic in here. It's all utility and card draw. Similarly, Ghitu Amplifier and where's the other one? The Spellrune Painter. All of these are more indicative of that go wide strategy that wants you to cast your spells on your turn, as opposed to being a more controlling version of the deck and running counter spells. Electrostatic Infantry, of course, doesn't really care one way or the other, but being able to cast those spells on your opponent's turn, it does potentially lead to some interesting situations if they've already committed to swinging into a board state, and you're able to use things like Fading Hope, Flowstone Infusion, or Play with Fire to not only pump your Electrostatic Infantry, but potentially save it from damage-based removal, as well as screwing with their board state by removing one or more creatures from the equation. Continuing with the 2-drops here, we've got Battlewing Mystic, and I think this is a good card, but honestly, I think a 1-of is probably not the right quantity. This is just what I'm running for testing purposes. I think this goes a little bit better in the go wide strategy here, and it's primarily here as a way to refill our hand in late game. And I think either 2 copies is going to be right or 0. I think 1, 3, or 4 is probably not the way we end up going. Impulse obviously is a function of card draw, and I'm not in love with this spell for this deck. I'm really looking for something else here that I just haven't quite found yet. I think we have spoken quite a bit about Electrostatic Infantry. In between this and Balmor, I think Infantry is the better card in the way I ultimately want to go with this deck. If for no other reason, Balmor's legendary status makes it fundamentally less profitable to run 4 copies. I think 3 would probably be the right quantity in a Balmor-based deck. In anything that's not all in on that go wide spells master strategy, I think 2 is easily the maximum. Fires of Victory. This again is going to have to do with whether we're casting spells on our turn or their turn. Either way, to maximize this spell, 5 mana is a lot, and I'm not sure this is the right answer for this deck. We'll have to see how this plays out. Amplifier, I think 2-3 copies is probably where this wants to be. Again, kicking for 5 mana. Unless you're swinging for that Alpha Strike, Balmor situation is a lot of mana to sink in, and probably means you didn't cast a lot of other spells, but instead had to remove an essential blocker. But maybe that opens up the way for a less committed Alpha style strike, where then you survive the swing back and then go in with a second Alpha, or what would you call that, a Beta strike, to go ahead and close out the game. Lightning Strike, it's good. Just take my word on that. It's certainly not something that the old-timers like myself really need to be adding to their collection. 2 is obviously not the right number in this deck, but for budget purposes, that's all I'm putting in it at the moment, because we know this card is good, and by running fewer of these right now, it opens up other slots for us to test other things. I think ultimately there's very little argument against this being a 4 quantity in the deck. Reckless Impulse is a direct port over from the original Spellslingers deck, and card draw in this deck, obviously very good. Sorcery speed isn't great. I'd like to be doing potentially some other things here, but it's the cards I know you have, and until we make other decisions about the deck, this is a very good placeholder, and it doesn't force you to put too many resources into this. Smoldering Egg is a nice turn to defender option to hold back some of those other aggro things going on, not force you to block with your Electrostatic Infantry and put it at risk, and becomes a threat in its own right. And the dragon, of course, is very nice for that mid-game, late-game thing. But more often than not, this card is going to simply buy you time to try and get some other things going. Twinferno, I think, has a lot of potential, both in the twin cast aspect, as well as the double strike. How it fits into the various archetypes is really what we're trying to explore here. You literally get this out of one of the jump index. It's also a card which is an easy uncommon to pick up late because a lot of people aren't loving this in draft. So testing a copy here should be pretty painless. Arcane Infusion, of course, is a holdover from the original deck, and it's a nice way to keep our hand full, either in early or late game. And of course, Flashback allows it to do double duty and always give us something to cast on our turns. Thirst for Discovery, pretty basic land draw, and once you get to 5 or 6 mana, those basic lands are going to be pretty unimportant. You can dump those very easily here to make this a draw 2 and filter 1, if nothing else. Haughty Djinn, so haughty. This is from one of the jump-in decks. I'm not sure this is the right direction really at all for this deck. It might be a win more card, but if we don't test it and see how it plays, we're never really going to know. Its instance and sorcery cost reduction is very nice, but of course we already have a card that does that. And this is not necessarily an easy draft. People are definitely picking this up and then going all in on this deck archetype in the draft, because I think ultimately this is a stronger archetype in the limited environment than it is in the overall constructed environment. The blue spells fits very nicely with both white and red, and to a slightly lesser degree black as well. So this is not a card that you're going to see coming as a secondary pick on your drafts very often. And of course that makes it a little harder for us budget players to be guaranteed it. But again, depending upon your jump-in choices, having one copy is probably not hard here and definitely worth the test slot. Revelations, Geistflame Reservoir, and the Painter are all fairly obvious holdovers from the original Spellslinger deck. Keldon Flamesage is another one of those cards. I want to test how Enlist works here. This might be worth enlisting and then tapping something like your Electrostatic Infantry or your Balmor or something like that you don't necessarily want to put at risk. But whether it's good enough to hold a 3-drop slot here, whether it's providing enough pseudo card draw remains to be seen. Vadrik is our other cost reduction and is another potential go tall aspect here. I know everyone has a copy of this from the new player experience, so there's no reason not to run it here. This card is ultimately going to depend on how the deck shakes out, primarily between those two different strategies. One, obviously, it has a stronger place in than the other. And this is from those older sets that drafting may not make sense for you, depending upon where you are in your arena career. So getting multiple copies of this is highly unlikely for many of you. And it was definitely not a priority card even when we were drafting the Midnight Hunt. So this is a card that may or may not probably leaning towards may not make that final version of the deck. Memory Deluge is just very good card draw. You've already got the copy from your new player experience, no reason not to run it. Very similar with Big Score, the treasure tokens can be nice when you're trying to ramp out something, or to have those big 3 and 4 spell turns. Just gives you a lot of options. Ardent Elementalist, I think this is a card that ultimately fits best into that go wide strategy. It doesn't really do enough as a 4-drop in that go tall aspect, but getting a crucial instant or sorcery back, that clutch removal, bounce, maybe even a additional card draw can really do a lot for you. And then particularly in that go wide aspect, it can do some work for you on the board before it ultimately just dies to the fact that it has 1 toughness. And of course, Seas of Storm is that other card. It fits most notably in the go tall aspect here and allows you to diversify your threats on the board and make them decide what to do with the removal. The fact that it has trample, much the same way Electrostatic Infantry does, allows it to really hit regardless of what the board state is. There's not too many decks that can go as tall as we can. I think this card definitely has a spot in both versions of the deck as a late mid-game finisher. The potential that it's only 1 red and everything else is colorless really sets it up nicely for those cost reduction aspects. Really, again, in either version, depending upon how we go. And I think the 2 copies that you get from your new player experience really are likely to find a home in either version of the deck. So get used to this, figure out your timing on it, and of course cost reduction also affects the flashback cost, which is the biggest hindrance on this, is the difficulty of being able to secondary cast this for 7. Makes it a very nice way of utilizing that cost reduction. And guys, that's the deck. I wouldn't put a lot of resources into this at this point. It's still just in that good with potential, aka the bad category. I don't think it's going to rise above that this season, but it has the potential to do some very big things. Electrostatic Infantry and Balmor both came to us in the recent set. There's no reason to think that Spells Matter is not going to be a highly supported archetype in at least 2 out of the 3 sets here over the next year. And then, of course, we have all next year for Standard as well, doing big things potentially with either one of those cards in this type of archetype. So this is one of those that even incidental effort will allow you to grow and experiment with this deck, which is perfect for budget players, so that we might have an explosive, high-powered deck at some point over the next 2 years in Standard for very little effort. And it's worth playing around with and giving a little bit of research and consideration to, even if it hasn't quite earned dedicated resources just yet.
And with all that having been said, don't forget, smash that like button like Ronnie J would. And no matter where in the world you are watching this from, I hope you have a magical day. And until next time, I'll see you in the arena.